do. So this is our first Pieces to Piece interview.
Excellent.
So I have, yes, you're starting us off.
Wow.
Very special. So this is Andy Brine of Your Soul's Pathway. Mm-hmm. And we're going to talk about archetypes and what's going on in a narcissistic relationship with the archetypes. So, before we move on, what are archetypes?
There are many different ways to explain archetypes.
Yeah.
But what I feel like archetypes allow us to do is really identify certain patterns we're living by and certain aspects within ourselves that we can relate to. Archetypes are very much symbols that we can connect with to identify ourselves, you know, and within each and every archetype you've got positive aspects and negative aspects, which the positive is the positive expression of who we are, and the negative is the shadow and potentially negative expression that wouldn't be conducive to who we really are, if that makes sense.
Okay, so when did you first discover archetypes?
I discovered them quite a while ago, and for those of you who don't know me, I've got a background in hypnosis, hypnotherapy, and I studied the work of Joseph Campbell many years ago and the hero's journey, and I knew about archetypes back then. I thought it was fascinating to understand ourselves through archetypes, and in order for me to heal my own self through my own journey, archetypes really helped me to see my own patterns and conditioning. But what was interesting when I looked at the hero's journey and archetypes is the fact that the archetypes overlay really perfectly with our own journeys, which a lady called Carol Pearson overlaid the hero's journey archetypes, or that were based on Carl Jung's work, with the hero's journey. And my work's evolved now into the soul pathway, which is my own interpretation of the hero's journey as it relates to our own spiritual journeys and growth. But archetypes really does fit in well with that, in terms of, you know, if we look at our ego, ourself, and our shadow, our ego is our conditions, and, you know, the first layer of consciousness within ourselves in terms of our archetypal expression. And then we've got the shadow aspects of that, and the shadow aspects of our own journey when we go through a process of healing. Yeah, it can be quite challenging at times, but again, they really help us to heal in an incredible way. So.
Can you give us an example of an archetype and its positive and its shadow attributes and how they might play out in your life?
Definitely. I like to speak about archetypes in regards to the masculine and feminine, because I feel our journey is very much creating a balance and harmony of the masculine and feminine within ourselves, you know. So when I look at archetypes, I often look at the warrior and the caregiver, because the warrior is very much the masculine expression in terms of energy, and the caregiver is very much the feminine expression of who we are. But if we look at the warrior is often seen as that negative archetype that's frowned upon, you know, not good for us. And yet what's more important to look at with this archetype is more that, are we living by the conditions of the archetype, or are we actually transcending our consciousness throughout the archetype? And another aspect of it, are we representing the shadow of it? So let me briefly go through that and explain that, because there's a lot to it, I would say, but not a lot to it in another way. Because if we look at the conditions of the warrior, the conditions are that the warrior likes to compete, be the best, fight for what they want in life, and they might not have any consideration of others that are around them. So when we look at that, we think the men in society are brought up in society to you know, bring home the money, you know, be the career person within the relationship, and so they fight for that position. And when we're living by the conditions like those, that's very much societal conditioning there. But as we evolve through that archetype and we shift our consciousness, we're more so coming from a place of, fighting more so for the cause of what we want. So we have others in mind. So I'm fighting for you now. I'm there fighting for equal rights and opportunities for everybody. So the consciousness shifts to more of an altruistic intent.
So rather than kind of that more egotistical, my position in society, kind of fighting for everybody, like moving from the individual really to the collective.
I would say we start off living through the conditions of the ego in terms of consciousness. Then we move to ourself, which is looking at what's important for ourselves, but also what's important to others as well. And then we shift to the third layer of consciousness within that. I think it's that collective of, the community that we're trying to serve. Like, what are we truly fighting for? What is the cause within that? But obviously the shadow aspects of the warrior is to really be quite bullish in some ways, and not really have that care and thought of others, but that's quite natural to spot, isn't it? In terms of that warrior.
I guess it's balancing it, isn't it?
But I think it's okay to have that within ourselves, because if we look at the caregiver is a loving, caring mother that represents the feminine energy. But from a conditioned caregiver, it can be very detrimental to ourselves. I very much see myself as, a caregiver in some respects, very much in my workplace, whereby I'm constantly giving love and care, yet I'm neglecting my own needs. So in relationships, you could be giving and not receiving that for yourself.
That's common, that, isn't it? Yeah.
Definitely. And the interesting thing about the shadow of that is that because we're giving and receiving and not receiving, we can take on the role of the victim and pass blame and guilt trip other people. Not intentionally, but it's like, I'm giving so much all the time and I'm not receiving back. So I think it's always important to identify that and say, because I often think about that myself. I've got to make sure that I'm not coming from this place of putting guilt on others, because this is my own conditioning that is causing me to act out of the caregiver. But when we shift to another layer of consciousness within the caregiver, it's noticing that care for myself and yourself. Self-care being the important lesson though, and having the balance of giving and receiving of both.
Which I think brings us very neatly into so what's going on in the archetypes from your perspective in a narcissistic relationship.
That's very interesting. I spoke to a client about this the other night, and I'll obviously keep it confidential, but it's really interesting noticing what archetype we're expressing in a relationship. So are we expressing that warrior and trying to get what we want out of the relationship, or are we coming from that caregiver where we are giving ourselves and our full selves, our full love, and we're not receiving that in return? And maybe there's an element of abuse there that we're not noticing, because I think it's easy to neglect that abuse that we are receiving, because we don't want to, because from a narcissistic point of view, we don't want to see it because we want to see the good in other people, don't we? So
and I think that's something that people, often the kind of person that gets into that kind of relationship does see the good in people. So what would you say that from the perspective of the archetypes, what would you say that kind of relationship is helping somebody to develop?
I think it goes back to the caregiver and that self-love. It comes back to that self-love of who we are, but also archetypes, we express all of the archetypes all the time, yet some are more dominant than others in our lives. So when we look at balancing out the archetypes, I always look at balancing out that masculine and feminine. So if you're coming from that place of the caregiver, we constantly give you love and care, what's important I would say, is to bring out that warrior a bit more, because that is bringing out that masculine balance that you need, because you're not connecting with that masculine so much, you're connecting more so with the feminine, and you're not standing up for yourself so much, but not from a place of I'm more important, but that each and every one of us is important. We need to love ourselves within that.
Right.
If that makes sense.
So how would someone go about finding what's going on in their archetypes, and which one's more dominant?
Well, I've got an archetypal assessment that I run with people within my Archetypes for Life program, which is a 78 questionnaire set of questions.
Whoa, that's thorough.
Yeah, and this was actually Carol Pearson's Hero's Journey archetypal assessment that I use within my work. But it's fascinating to understand, which archetype we're expressing, and when we can identify that, we can see whether we're expressing the positive aspects or the shadow.
Okay.
But if we're expressing it to a high level, a high degree, so they all go up to, I think it's 25 or 30 in terms of the numbers, because each number's counting to a multiple of 5.
Okay.
Then if we're a higher expression, then we're naturally expressing the positive aspects of it.
Right.
Yeah. If we're quite low on that scale, then it's shown that we're often expressing the shadow aspects more so.
Okay.
But one thing that I did want to mention with the archetypes is the orphan and the innocence, because we spoke about that quite a lot, didn't we, before?
Before we have done, yeah.
Because I feel they're very much more relevant to a narcissistic relationship, because if I go through the orphan, for example, the orphan as an archetype is someone that's been neglected and abused from a young age. And I know you mentioned a narcissistic scale, didn't you? Or...
The narcissism spectrum scale, yeah.
So if I was to ask you about that, how would you explain that in terms of understanding ourselves and our own narcissism, or the narcissism of the others?
So with the narcissism spectrum scale, we're all on the scale, and you can be more at the narcissism end, which is I'm more special, or you can be more at the what's called the egoism end, technical term that this author has created, Dr. Craig Malkin. And the egoism end is, everybody else is more special than me. So that lack of self-care. So it would sound, in terms of those archetypes that you've mentioned, to me it sounds like there's more warrior shadow
within the narcissism,
at the narcissistic end, and more caregiver shadow at the egoist.
Very interesting.
And then 5 is that place of balance in the middle.
Interesting. Very interesting. Because I thought I'd mention that because I could, when you spoke about it before, I could sort of see that within the innocent and the orphan as well.
Yeah. So what would you say is happening with the innocent and the orphan?
Well, the orphan, as I said, is the one that's been neglected and abused, often from a young age. And, I've read in some places that often that's where narcissism can be born from, which is sad. And interesting thing about the orphan is when we are the orphan, we don't want to see the situation. We don't want to look back at the pain and suffering.
No.
So the neglect becomes a part of us.
Right.
And we adopt that orphan throughout our lives in many ways.
Sure.
But the orphan is the one that's been neglected and abused. And obviously that's from a conditioned sense, but because we don't want to see that, the second layer of the orphan archetype is self-acceptance and healing, and accepting the healing of others.
Yeah.
And I don't feel, and this is a sad thing to say, but I don't feel like a lot of people that are narcissistic or have those tendencies will want to go through that place of self-acceptance and healing, because they don't want to recognize it within themselves. in many ways.
It's a painful process to go through, isn't it?
Oh, definitely.
Healing's not all beautiful lights and everything, is it? It's going through the fire, through the pain. So is it? So the innocent then, is that more someone who hasn't experienced that kind of abuse, and they're...
Yeah, if I go through the orphan a bit more, because the orphan as an archetype, when they are playing the role of the orphan or expressing the orphan quite a lot, they actually play the role of the innocence.
Oh, I see. Okay.
So the people that are vulnerable, and they play the role of the innocence, which I think is very relevant in narcissistic relationships, because they say that they're the victims.
Right.
Yeah, often they can be the ones that cause the harm.
Yes. Yeah.
But I thought that was really interesting to identify with.
That is quite an interesting dynamic, isn't it?
Yeah. So the first layer of the orphan archetype is understanding one's own plight, one's own neglect and abuse. You know, accepting the need for help of others to be rescued. And the third layer of the archetype is banding together to support others. You know, often creating that support group. So I think there's a lot of people that have gone through neglect and abuse from a young age, and a lot of healers and therapists will be that orphan, but the orphan from I'll wait for that. We're on a flight path here, I didn't realise. But the orphan from very much a higher level of consciousness place, you know, where they're not obviously expressing the shadow of that, because the shadow of the orphan can be, you know, cynicism, as it says, callousness, playing the role of the victim, and wanting to manipulate the environment. And I think the manipulation even goes back to childhood as well, because they feel the need to manipulate the environment to escape it.
Right, sure.
At least that's the thought process that I went through in my mind when people have gone through deep trauma. Yeah. I mean, how can we fully comprehend what's going on as a child? You know, we've got to somehow escape it, don't we? I feel.
Yeah, definitely. You need some kind of coping mechanism to feel safe enough to keep going, don't you?
Yeah, and I feel because they're children, they don't have the proper coping mechanisms as us adults do. So that's the only way that they found to do it. Which is sad, but it's part of it. So the innocence is quite self-explanatory, but we all live in a place of innocence when we grow up. The world's all beautiful, sunshine and rainbows. Oh, lovely place. And it is, you know. But, you know, soon enough we wake up to realise our parents told us that it was beautiful, and now they're telling us to watch out for strangers. You know?
Very true, yeah.
So we realise that it's not all what it's cracked up to be sometimes. So it's waking up to that place of innocence, and often we go through that fall from grace. At least that's what they say. In the spiritual world in some ways. But yeah, it's got disillusionment here, being woken up to that disillusionment.
And I guess that's kind of, so that's what, certainly that was my experience of a narcissistic relationship, that it is kind of jolt to make you see kind of things are not all rosy 100% of the time, and it's about transcending that shadow to expressing all of these archetypes fully. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, definitely. And it's funny you mentioned that innocent bit there, because like we said earlier, like we feel like we want to be innocent to what's going on, so we express that innocence because we want to see the beauty that's in them. And then one moment just clicks, and then we realise, wow, I've actually woken up to this now, and what's happening to me, which again is that dark place, but through that dark place we can then heal, can't we? So that's
excellent. So thank you for that explanation.
Okay.
I think it's interesting to kind of see all the different perspectives on it. And so where can people find out more about your work?
If you wanted to find out about the archetypal stuff, I think the archetypes are really good at helping us identify our own situations.
Okay.
So with relation to your narcissism stuff, it could be a good support with helping identify some of those things. But the Archetypes for Life course, which is on Udemy, it's very general in some ways. It's obviously not focused on narcissism, but it can help us to identify those things. My work is all about the soul pathway and helping you connect with your own soul pathway and disconnect from patterns and conditions of the ego, and really connect with our soul essence and who we truly are. And you can find out more about that on my website, which is www.thesoulpathway.tv.
Excellent. So thank you, Andy. I think we've
thanks so much.
Kicked off the Pieces to Piece interviews in great style.
Yeah, thanks so much. It's been great, and I loved our first interview as well, our first conversation, because I really think this is so important, talking about this stuff, because it's quite a dark place at times.
Yeah. And bringing the light of understanding to it is vital.
Yeah, definitely. So thanks.